Welcome to week 10 tutorial for MGMT 1020 Entrepreneurship and New Venture Management. And thanks, Lauren, for giving me this opportunity to take over this week. So today we would be looking at funding and financial management for startup ventures. And before we get started into the order of day, I'd like to take you through the importance of why this is a critical area which often gets missed in the hustle and bustle of getting, going to market and getting your venture started. And at the same time, what the critical aspects of looking at financial management are. We'll do a quick recap of your lecture before we get into activities for the tutorial today. So what are the reasons that most ventures need funding or financing? Well, among the key reasons why a startup may need to apply either for their own funds or look for external funds would be basically to get through cash flow challenges. So have enough money rotating within the business to be able to meet expenses and at the same time be getting adequate revenue to support the organization and operations of the organization. To be able to make capital investments, say you're wanting to start producing on your own, and thus you need to invest in, say, machinery, get a warehouse, invest in land perhaps. So long-term capital investments is another avenue which startups or ventures look at while looking to see sources of putting their money out. And then, of course, the core reason would be when one is getting started would be towards product development, research. Often, depending on the industry that one belongs to, there are lengthy product cycles, which again become challenging, and thus firms often sort of look to external sources of money. There are various alternatives and ways in which funding can be sought. Lauren has discussed this in a lot more detail, but just the high level bit. So there's personal funding. So a lot of bootstrapping, putting your own investments or savings, borrowing from friends and family. Debt financing again is quite a popular way in which organizations function. It may not always be the best alternative for startups, but definitely one of the ways in which new ventures can look at raising funds. Equity capital, and lastly, creative sources. And creative sources is what we've had considerable discussion about as well. So last week, Jen took you through the very interesting case study of Flow Hive. And in fact, it was quite a relevant one given that it covered pretty much all aspects of a new venture. So starting from product development, looking at research, identifying the target market, and then of course, looking towards seeking funding. So crowdfunding, one of the creative avenues of raising funds, was the mode that Flowhive sort of sought and was very successful at as well. Then, of course, looking at operations, managing their teams, managing supply chains, customers, and then, of course, looking at expansion. So quite an interesting case, gives you a sort of holistic view of what startup life and a successful one can look at. So crowdfunding, we will be looking at from a critical lens today as well. So why are funding or financial objectives of a firm important, and what are the types of financial objectives that firms may have? So some of the key ones why financial objectives form an integral part of maybe even a business plan are to be able to assess profitability, to identify the sources of revenue making, and then obviously be able to assess whether or not the operation overall within a set period of time is profit making, loss making, or when it may turn profitable. So maintaining liquidity is an other important reason why firms need to look at their financial status. Having efficient operations, so to be able to manage productivity and to be able to ensure that the assets that the firm owns are productive enough. And lastly, to maintain the overall stability of the organization and to be able to meet all its creditor requirements, and also to be able to say source materials, to be able to pay salaries, etc. And lastly, what are the ways in which these financial objectives can be measured? So that's where the bulk of our discussion today will rest, around the kind of statements and the use of various financial statements that, even though one may not be an accounting major, one must have, as a business owner, the ability to be able to read, analyze, and make sense of what the financial statements are saying, why they are important, and the elements that must be included in them, and then of course how they can be made more efficient, as well as used in terms of past analysis and projections. So historical statements give you a way to assess past performance. A lot of ratios that are looked at as well enable the study of past performance, looking at profitability and other metrics. Present, of course, is where you manage sort of day-to-day, transactions, etc. And then future or pro forma statements enable projections in terms of, let's say, the next year's sales, and thus related expenses and other aspects of your statements, or even the next 5 years, 10 years. So often within a business plan, one does need to consider how the business would shape in the next 5 years, 10 years. So have like a short, medium term, and as well as a long-term plan. And that's where these financial statements come in very handy. All right, so now that we are done with looking at quickly what the lecture covered last week, I'd like to take you through an interesting video, which basically makes us all sort of careful about what entails crowdfunding. So yes, we know of the positives, and it is an extremely popular sort of mode of seeking funding, especially for creative, really fast-moving, consumer-driven businesses. But there are also things to be mindful of before one sort of considers one funding mechanism vis-a-vis the other. So today we'll be looking at what things one must keep in mind while looking at crowdfunding.
The pitfalls that the companies themselves have to worry about come in a couple of varieties. So number one, is the company really the right candidate for an equity crowdfunding campaign? We've seen in the crowdsourcing space that the companies that do the best tend to be consumer products companies, or the people out there that are doing these portals and these sites have some sort of affinity for the product. That's why films do so well. I think consumer products companies are probably best suited for this sort of platform. So the reason I mention that is because a major pitfall would be for a company that doesn't have that sort of engagement with the public and can't build that kind of affinity, listing on a platform, tying itself into a crowdfunding form of funding, and then failing to raise its funding. That would not be a good thing. That would be a pitfall. So I think you have to be real careful that you get the right kind of company for this. Secondly, assuming that the company does get listed on a portal and it does crowdfund, disclosure is going to be very important. Here in the Silicon Valley, where I'm primarily based and primarily practice, companies sometimes go a little skeptical on disclosure to their investors. We're allowed to do that oftentimes with the types of placements that they do. Not like that with crowdfunding. Every material fact is going to have to be disclosed. And some of us worry that companies are not going to be in a position to make all of the material disclosures that they should, just because of the size of the transactions that they're allowed to complete and because of the administrative costs behind that. So I'd say the number one legal pitfall is disclosure. Secondly, keep in mind that once you're into this system, you might end up with lots and lots and lots of little shareholders. And this is something that comes more from wisdom than from They say the life of the law is experience, and this is something that comes from experience. Lots of investors means lots of potential plaintiffs. Lots of investors means lots of problems. Investors have a right to information. They have a right to bug the company. They may want to be transferring shares, although they're limited in doing that under this model. But they may have lots of questions. They may place a lot of demand on the management's time. It may be a very high distraction value to having lots of little shareholders. And then thirdly, keep in mind, if you need more money, and if you need institutional money down the road, how are they going to view a company that has hundreds of little unaccredited and possibly non-sophisticated, probably non-sophisticated shareholders? How are they going to view that? I can tell you that I have had deals crater because there are too many unsophisticated shareholders. So it's something that I think a company has to very carefully consider before they make the decision to list on the portal. Now, for the right company, this could be a very good thing, but for a lot of companies, they may want to go the traditional route.
All right, so that was interesting bit around things to be mindful of when deciding on one way or source of funding vis-a-vis another. And obviously one can delve deep into different like advantages and disadvantages of each of the sources. And I would say it also depends on the type of industry that one is operating in and the stage of one's business as well. Let's now look at financial management, which we would be sort of exploring a little more in detail today, and why it is an important aspect of the overall venture as well as the business plan. So what does financial management mean? It relates to how the firm utilizes the funds it is able to raise or it is able to generate through its operations, as well as how it measures its return on investment. So what are the factors that the firm considers as success factors when it comes to utilizing their funds? And there are various ways in which this can be considered. And again, it depends on the stage of the business as well. So while funding and sources of funding are equally important, it's also important to be able to manage your finances well, and how it may vary depending on if you're on the initial stages. You may want to divert your funds perhaps towards product development, prototyping, testing, and you may want to raise funds to be able to support those stages of your business. Eventually, once maybe, or if it is not relevant to the business, the venture may want to invest in market research or maybe even conducting a pilot launch study. And these, of course, can be iterative processes as well. Later, at a later stage, a firm may decide to invest in towards streamlining operations, having better distribution networks, even investing in hiring team members and hiring skilled personnel to be able to deliver that product or service, as well as fine-tuning overall business processes. So there are various avenues in which the funds raised can be invested. And as a prudent business manager, it's important to be able to decide what's critical at that particular juncture for the business to be able to divert your funds in the right direction. This financial management and control, in fact, is also an area where many startups fail, either due to underestimation or overestimation of their initial startup costs, maybe hefty founder remuneration. You're just too excited with the kind of money your firm has been able to raise, instead of rather investing in product development, market research, and basically getting your product out there, as being too big and too quick. This is, in fact, one of the major challenges that a lot of firms today face. So they may have a great idea, they've nailed the product, they've nailed the customer audience, and they've just reached a scale which they're not able to handle on their own. And some of this is also evident in the case in your textbook on Wiseacre Frozen Treats. So if you have a chance to have a read of that case and look at the questions there. So as a business owner, you must be familiar with financial statements and how they make sense, how to read them. Some of the statements that we looked at in your lectures refer to cash flow statements, profit and loss, or also known as income statements, your balance sheets, as well as key ratios, which are a practical way to make sense of the firm's profitability, liquidity, and financial stability. So how can a business manager look or ensure that they are on the right track? I suppose although it may not, how are we doing? Are we making money or are we losing money? And a lot of the statements that we will be looking at will help you address these questions. How much cash do we have at hand? So the balance sheet, for example, the assets will help you address this question. Do we have enough cash to meet our short-term obligations? How efficiently are we utilizing our assets? Are we investing and utilizing the land space that we have or the machinery that we've investing it well? How do our growth and net profits compare with those of our peers? So comparing yourself against industry standards, pitching your firm's performance vis-a-vis your key competitor, which often actually would even start from the stage since when you plan your business plan, or even pitch your business idea to investors as well. Where will the funds we need for capital improvements come from? So what would be the sources of funds that we can tap into? Are there ways we can partner with other firms to share risk and reduce overall, the kind of exposure and cash you may need? So are there any strategic partnerships that your firm can explore? Again, quite relevant and useful for new ventures today, as well as overall assessing on a regular basis the financial health of your business. So with these application questions directly from your textbook, so take time, perhaps pause the video and try and look at these application questions. They are quite straightforward, and our discussion today as well as your lecture notes would help you address all of them. So I'd like you to look at page 327 and look at questions or try answering questions 821, 8025, as well as application question 827. So look at these questions, perhaps, spend some time pointing out the key things that you would like to include in your answer before you move on to the next task. Right? I'd like you to spend some time reading this really interesting short case and then taking the view that you are the venture capitalist who would want to decide to invest or not invest in this venture. So read this case. It's from your textbook again. It's You Be the VC 9.1. And the business that they are exploring is a company called Toctal. So you'd be able to read up more on their website and other social media pages. But this section, the small case, just gives you a brief overview of what the business idea was, what their core operations were, and how they were performing. And based on that, you can look at the two questions. And to be able to address this second question and to assist you in that decision making, here is an interesting You Be the VC scorecard. If we did have face-to-face lectures and tutorials, this would be something very engaging that we could have pursued. But feel free to use this as a template and try and, I suppose, rank the firm, Toctal, on certain criteria. So score them from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest, on aspects of the strength of the new venture team. So based on the information in the mini case, as well as additional information on the website, you would be able to get a lot more insight into the new venture team. Try and assess the strength of the opportunity. So even if the idea was a strong one, did it have market potential? And was it something that was worth pursuing or reaping rewards for the business? Would you consider it to be a strong performer within that industry? And how do you measure the business model? So do you think their current model is something that it has a lasting and sustainable value, and how it pitches against your understanding of lasting business models? And then overall, what your decision would be having considered these factors. So imagine that you are the venture capitalist who maybe needs to invest, say, 500,000 in this venture. would you decide to invest, yes or no? And either way, do offer your reason for that decision.